Jane Manning is a director of Allies and Morrison. She's an urban designer working on new developments like Northstowe in Cambridge, but also an expert on London's character, having written for English Heritage a report on London's local character and density, the findings of which form a major part of the new London plan. She's co-author of Complexity, which was published earlier this year. So Jane, why has characterisation become so important now? It's a core policy of both the Mayor and the Secretary of State at MHCLG, and that's one of the few things that they actually agree on.
Indeed it is, indeed it is. I think there's a lot of factors that have come together, I think, to get us to the point where now characterisation is seen as so important. I think there's sort of much longer trends around, generally around discussions around design quality, the reaction perhaps to sort of blandness of some developments over the last 40 years, communities generally feeling that developments aren't valuing the local enough, perhaps not adding richness or showing enough pride perhaps in that. And that obviously is, that's a much bigger issue around sort of distrust that's sort of built into that over time. But I think sort of a key point came with the Localism Act 10 years ago. That was a real adrenaline shot in the arm, and started to sort of move lots of that, the sort of issues behind all of that to the forefront, and particularly, I suppose, give greater importance and credence to local views and understanding. That then obviously has sort of set in train lots of further changes that came through planning system, and now those are kind of continuing to work their way through with the new white paper. But obviously that all sits alongside a housing crisis and a need to achieve numbers. And I think there is a real sense that, there is a big conflict between that sort of protecting local character and how communities and people feel about their places, but on one hand versus, the real need to achieve housing numbers. And in many ways, characterisation sort of sits quite squarely as a middleman, and has the potential, at least, to try and bring those two pieces together. And I think that over time, and certainly over the last 10 years, has gained much greater traction. In London, I think the example, Historic England have been really central to that, in getting to the point where characterisation is so central to the London plan. Their work over many years and sort of culminating in the Keep It London campaign, in the research that we did with them, and that really sort of being able to give a much more tangible piece and sort of proactive contribution, I suppose, to sort of planning policy development. There was a definite key moment there. But I perhaps suppose sort of almost sort of lastly, but more practically, the role of, I think, geographic information systems, GIS, has shifted how characterisation is seen. It's made it much more tangible, something more physical and concrete. I think people generally within sort of planning, architectural and design spheres perhaps feel a little bit more that they can grab hold of it more easily. And particularly, I think, for sort of planning, both sort of Mayor of London, Secretary of State, there's a sort of sense that the policy no longer just has to be about nice words of respecting character. There's something more substantial you can link to that, more that you can show. There's more information to bring to the debate, and the sort of evidence behind that. So I think there's sort of lots of elements, and all those sort of aspects have kind of come together and got us to a great point, really. But I think it's also a sort of example of where sort of the research side within the design industry can have great influence. It's a real example of quite a small project led by Historic England and ourselves that actually had a significant influence. So it's a kind of great, good news story, I think, for the design industry too.
But I guess also the issue has been exacerbated slightly by the need for density of housing in London, particularly taller buildings, and particularly in outer London.
Definitely. And I think, a lot of in the sort of previous version of the London plan with the opportunity areas and the numbers that were attached to those opportunity areas, that really was an important catalyst in bringing everything to a head, I think, around that issue particularly.
So how do you assess the character of a place? You sit down and start. What are the sort of things that drive your thinking?
Well, I think the first bit we found is character is a word that lots of people use. We all use it ad infinitum at times. And really sort of over a few years in these sort of early days of doing these studies, we realised actually there's a need to better define what we mean by character and sort of give a sort of level playing field to that. And where certainly we come from is it is definitely about a physical thing. You know, it is about the buildings, the streets, the spaces, what people see every day. But it's not just that, it's also the social side of things, about how people inhabit those buildings and spaces, how they change their uses over time, the imprints that different communities leave on places. And then thirdly, it's also the historical and really understanding how layers of different periods of history have left their mark, how certain decisions have sort of lasting impressions, and really bringing all of those factors together. Now, in terms of how we sort of look at that and where we start, the benefit being that we're now so much more data rich is great. There's much more that we can use, much more ability to see those interactions between different factors. It's about, I think, you know, the basics, you know, on the physical side around design quality principles, all the things that we've been talking about for years, the sort of principles that we all had as part of the CABE work, around grain, connectivity, resilience, all of that, but starting to kind of understand what that means. In terms of how we work, there are, I suppose, sort of three elements within that particularly. One is obviously a lot of desktop analysis on all of those three fronts, and there's lots of data we can use for that. The second, though, is very much experience on the ground. You know, nothing can kind of replace walking every single street of an area or characterizing, and that's important. But it's also about talking to people and understanding those sort of nuances of what's valued. As a rule, I think there sort of perhaps should be more cups of tea shared than layers of data that you bring in, and it's, you know, making sure that sort of balance plays out. Ultimately, it's about kind of, you know, identifying what's special, what's typical, and there's all sorts of pieces that will often rise to the top in that, particularly in when you're then defining and starting to sort of set in train what happens afterwards or what's appropriate. Building heights always sort of tend to sort of rise to the top and sort of become quite a defining factor. Density and intensity of uses also, but greenery too, on a sort of you know, strategic green infrastructure side, but also the sort of just kind of street trees, elements, sort of front gardens, etc., and what they are bringing to the sort of quality and the experience of place. I think what we've been able to do in lots of the character studies, though, is to start to sort of move how we analyse this much more significantly forward. So as part of the complex city work, we found some much more interesting ways of bringing those things together. And there were sort of two, I suppose, key factors that we started to really drill into. The first was using floor area ratio as a much more rounded measure of density, sort of giving a much greater sense of intensity rather than dwellings per hectare. Then laying into that lots of other data around sort of, you know, age, so recognizing that the oldest pieces were also the densest and the most adaptable, looking at the churn in land uses within buildings and spaces. And we were also able to sort of start testing perhaps some of those, the great examples that we've seen of intensification, and looking at quite what they'd managed to achieve, sort of measuring their FAR. And we found quite often that you were able to double the prevailing FAR of an area without actually sort of changing any sort of significant parameters around height, etc. And that sort of starts to sort of give a much more interesting way of looking at what is appropriate intensification, I suppose. On the other side, there was a sort of real need to kind of understand the resilience of areas on lots of levels. But one of the factors we were able to do was to start thinking much more of the greenery, the green infrastructure character of an area as a sort of proxy or indicator of its resilience to climate change. So bringing in, we use the urban greening factor that's within the London Plan as a measure of contribution for future developments, but apply that to existing places to give an understanding of actually what their inbuilt resilience was, and therefore quite what the change on that front might need to be. So not just looking at what its capacity is to accommodate built intensification, but also kind of intensification of nature at its sort of most basic level. I think one of the aspects sort of, the word kind of assessing character, there's sort of an important point to make and a kind of word of caution that we found around that. I think there is a lot of desire to kind of sort of grade areas and identify sort of poorer character areas, and there is a real danger in that. There's a danger of characterization at its heart is an issue of of subjectivity. We need to try and make it as objective as possible, and so we've got to be quite careful of not bringing our own prejudices and ideas to areas and our understandings. Where we've sort of, I suppose, balanced and kind of found a more comfortable space is to build much more on local people's views and their judgments on kind of quality and what they see as good and what they see as perhaps in need of improvement. That said, even with that, I think there is a real need to avoid still identifying areas of poor character. With a circular economy filter, there's a real need to avoid doing that, because it can all too easily end up leading to drawing dotted lines around areas, becoming about redevelopment ambitions. And really, there is a responsibility on characterization studies, I think, to value everything, not just about what sort of looks nice people value in terms of its contribution, but also the embodied carbon that everything, has at its heart. And therefore, ultimately, some of these character studies need to be much more about focusing on opportunities for improvement, and we perhaps need to get a bit more innovative at how we do that and how we sort of propose those changes that happen.
So you talk about listening to local people, and you're working with a number of boroughs on generating character studies and carrying out local consultation. And here in Chiswick, you've been doing that with Hounslow, and I've attended a couple of your sessions. So tell me about the sort of things you're doing around London for that.
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, we've been doing character studies and done lots of those really over the last 10 years. In many ways, I think we've sort of, with others in the industry, we sort of changed perhaps the way these studies are undertaken, the way they're perceived a bit. So it's moved from perhaps what they were sort of 10 or 15 years ago, being much more about dense tomes of more academic kind of character descriptions, less about kind of community engagement. And those were often sort of criticised for being about trying to preserve areas in aspic effectively. I think where we got to is something that's much more accessible, much more celebratory, really, and sort of really starts to sort of draw through what can be seen as important from an objective sense, but also, what local communities value and how useful that can be in steering future development. The crucial piece, I think, that's happened over that time as well is character studies now, rather than just being a description, go further to say, so what? And I think that's where it starts to get much more substantial in bringing kind of local people with you. the two studies we did about 4 or 5 years ago for Hackney and for Lewisham were quite important turning points in that sense. They both took everything a bit further, ended up much more talking about what does that mean, and both now underpin the local plans for those areas and sort of became the sort of bedrock really for the growth strategies within them. That was made possible, I think, by significant kind of engagement. Hackney one in particular, there was a whole series of workshops of running right from the outset of what's important, understanding the history of place and bringing people with us all the way through to designing and defining kind of growth strategies for the areas. That sort of approach is now very much endorsed within the London Plan policy, and now sort of every local authority is doing that, and so, which is great, and we're now doing lots more of those. National Model Design Code has obviously come in, and that's almost sort of put the process on steroids, if in some ways, and so the sort of scope, I think, of those character studies is now much more vast, and so, you know, we're doing a lot in one study, all generally involving a lot of community engagement throughout. So, you know, these studies now are not just character studies, they're growth strategies, they're tool building strategies, they're writing design policies, you know, and now they're defining design codes. And whilst we can do a lot and achieve a lot, you know, from our computers, and we've had to this year, particularly on lots of those studies, the community engagement is critical to it. Now, before COVID-19, you know, there was all sorts of ways that we'd found of speaking with people and taking people on that journey, drawing in lots of the experience of places, and that, you know, we were doing all sorts of kind of school workshops, we were doing memory sessions, sort of going into care homes and doing afternoon tea with residents and just talking about people's memories of the places, all the way through to, you know, sort of street events of kind of market stalls and starting to test ideas about future change. Now, obviously, all of those things became impossible over the last year, and so we and our client teams have had to work quite hard to try to translate that a bit more into maintaining the community input on projects. Now, generally, that's been digitally based, whether that's digital surveys or through kind of Zoom workshops, as many of all of us have experienced that shift. But it's also, you know, we found that often isn't enough. And so we found, you know, having individual conversations with community group leaders, people that run community assets, those conversations have been really useful, of embedding a much greater understanding of how communities function, you know, the sort of areas that certain centres draw from. But it's also helped to sort of broaden out the input to surveys as well, and sort of get promoting to the sort of harder to reach pieces as well, I think. I think all of that, as I said, is sort of all about kind of building the trust through the process. You know, I think we often sort of quote that point of that's the sort of often repeated quote of people don't like change, but they do like progress. And in many ways, characterization studies allow people to understand that sort of the story, and therefore puts it much more in a sense of progress, of quite how change should happen. In Merton, we just completed the character study, and that's been wholly done during the pandemic. We started in March last year, so it was literally all the way through. And we've worked really hard there to kind of maintain community engagement. But what's come through is some really lovely ideas, some of which have come direct from the community. Others have sort of come through the interactions between analysis and community comment. But there's some great sort of area specific kind of real character led growth strategies that have now, they've sort of fed through into their local plan, into the small site studies. It's sort of worked very well in a sort of joined up way, very much on that front, I think. Hounslow, as you mentioned, obviously doing lots of work in there, and that's going all the way through to design codes. And so there's lots of really sort of understanding how we engage with local people and how people understand what design codes are. And I think there's a kind of education role and a responsibility on us as well to do that. And we're also, I suppose, at the sort of ultimate end of all of this, you know, the role of GIS in making all of this so much more tangible is also the outputs of these studies can now be much more interactive. And so with a number of boroughs, we're now doing that translation so that, you know, it becomes really a sort of interactive tool, both for sort of planners and landowners, but also for your average resident to be able to look at their street and understand what's important and what change is appropriate.
Very good. So if everything has to be character led, does that mean that developments like, say, the Gherkin or Canary Wharf, which were departures from the surrounding norm at the time, does that mean those sorts of places won't happen in the future, and that might even be exacerbated by design codes?
I think it's a really important question. I think it kind of goes really to the heart of lots of the debate at the moment. I think we certainly feel characterization should never be about everything staying the same. You know, it is much more about the thread of character and how you pull that through from the layers of history into something that informs what future change should be. You know, in many ways, you use a kind of the book analogy of you're writing the next chapter in the story of a place. And to make that book, you know, for the reader to stay engaged, you need most of the characters to remain. You need a few twists and turns, though, or unexpected things to keep it interesting. And that might be, you know, a new character that enters the story. It might be seeing a new side to an existing character. You know, but it's got to sort of sit there, and the thread needs to sort of sit comfortably in order for it all to hang together. In another way, it's perhaps the opposite to the sort of kids' consequences game. You know, you don't want to be drawing the legs of the person without seeing the head and the body first. You know, it should never be a blank piece of paper, and that's the role of characterization. But I think, you know, there are some real cautious tales sort of here and sort of important points to make, you know, particularly as character makes a much more stronger entry into design guidance and codes, and the importance of those starts to really rack up. We've got to be quite careful, you know, particularly sort of that balance between sort of what is planning policy and guidance versus what is sort of architectural freedoms and sort of design response. You know, as others have said, you know, planning is perhaps there to set the floor, but not necessarily the ceiling. And that's, I feel, really important in terms of design quality and ambition. We've got to be clear about that. There's also, you know, a sense that exceptions are needed to prove the rule. And I think, you know, examples like the Gherkin and Canary Wharf, you know, tall buildings are a really good example of this. Tall buildings should be exceptional, you know, and in many ways, buildings like the Gherkin work better as exceptions than planned pieces. You know, characterization sits well with the planning system operating well as a constraint-based system rather than perhaps sort of too much proactive planning. Now, in that sense, you know, whilst a sort of characterization might set a design code that has all sorts of parameters, it does still enable the space for buildings to prove themselves worthy of being an exception. You know, they've got to show, you know, a really detailed and nuanced understanding of local context, strategic character. And any exception still got to sit comfortably, even if it isn't wholly in character. And I think my personal view is that it makes, you know, all of those buildings work much harder. It's not a limiting factor on design ambition. It just quite rightly makes us all work a lot harder to make those exceptions work really well.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Jane. Fascinating and Yes, I was actually trying to make the point about characterization last night, and I was writing to Hounslow about a planning application for a Conrad Shawcross sculpture in Bedford Park, which celebrates the fact that W.B. Yeats used to live in Bedford Park. And this is a very contemporary structure, but nevertheless seems to me to have be characterization of the area, because he was a key part of its cultural legacy. So these are really interesting issues. So thank you very much for discussing them.
Fantastic. No, great to speak with you, Peter. Thank you.